This isn't the radio. This is Songs for the Deaf, the third album by Queens of the Stone Age and one of the greatest concept albums ever made. People don't like to refer to a record like this as a concept album, instead preferring to associate the term with the Ziggy Stardusts of our time. But stories aren't always so complex. The phrase, "so I got in my car the other day," is the beginning of a story. Here's a story that probably sounds familiar if you're old enough. So I got in my car the other day and the disc in the CD player started up. It was a good album, but it wasn't the album I wanted to listen to in that moment. Maybe I wanted something heavier or more aggressive. Maybe I wanted something more mellow. The desire doesn't really matter. So I switched to a different disc, taking advantage of the unilaterally best feature of this car, the 6 CD changer, but none of the other slots were really working either. The music was all good, but I was too familiar with it. I wanted to hear something different. I was sure that there was something in my massive collection that would fit in this situation, but there was only so much room for CDs in my car. In the age before MP3 players or music streaming services, there wasn't a convenient way to listen to the music you wanted to at any place or time. That's where radio comes in. It didn't allow people to listen to the music they wanted to hear all the time, no, but it did a great job at letting people listen to a massive curated music library far more conveniently than they could otherwise. Radio is still a powerhouse today, but for many decades it was the way most people listened to music because they could effectively circumvent that entire problem. There was a problem with radio though. It only played stuff people wanted to listen to. After all, radio stations need an audience in order to attract advertisers and generate revenue. Josh Homme knew this problem quite well. Back in the mid-90s, he was the guitarist for one of the first and most influential stoner metal bands, QOTSA. By the release of their second album, Blues for the Red Sun, they garnered quite a following and were touring with acts like Metallica, but they weren't getting the kind of widespread radio play that their positive reception would suggest. That's because their sound was so different that it just didn't really fit anywhere on the radio landscape of that era. So when Homme gathered some friends and collaborators from his past and ongoing music projects to form Queens of the Stone Age, that was the goal. Instead of making innovative new music that wouldn't get played, Queens aimed to make innovative new music that would get played. As bassist and screamer Nick Oliveri put it, we play music that we want to hear but we can't buy in the stores, so we have to make it. And that's exactly what they did. The singles from Queen's sophomore album took over the airwaves and dominated the UK and US modern rock charts, despite sounding notably different from the Creeds and Linkin Parks of this post-grunge nu metal era. In addition to getting the airplay QOTSA never got, Rated R also sold quite well, going gold in both the UK and Australia and peaking at 14 on the top Heat Seekers chart in the US. It was accessible to mainstream rock audiences while also being as edgy and insane as Nick Oliveri's screaming would allow for. So I got in my car the other day and turned on this record, but instead of merely bopping my head to feel good hit of the summer like I normally did, I paid attention to the lyrics. Nicotine, value, Vicodin, marijuana, ecstasy, and alcohol. Nicotine, value, Vicodin, marijuana, ecstasy, and alcohol. The song's title isn't actually a reference to the track itself, instead referring to a literal hit of the drugs mentioned. It appears at first to be a celebration of drug use, but Homme never explicitly endorses any of the substances. He merely just states their names. This ambiguity surrounding drug use permeates throughout the entire record, resulting in an album which sounds like a cohesive whole and not merely just a collection of tracks. Music isn't a narrative-focused art. Narrative is merely a tool, a lyrical component, which an artist can optionally use to enhance the message behind the art. Music doesn't have to be about anything, but when it is, it starts conversations. At first, theming was only really present in the radio-friendly single, as that was the only way for people to listen to music for decades. It wasn't until the development and commercialization of the 12-inch vinyl record that artists started to compile tracks into long-form projects. This development reached its logical extreme in the late 1960s with the developing psychedelic era of rock music, a hallucinogen-fueled dive into thematic progressivism. Albums became more than a mere collection of tracks. The tracks began to connect and interact with one another. As bands and artists began to experiment more and more with the idea of viewing the album as a cohesive whole, singles began to sound very different from their album counterparts. In some cases, the idea of a single was phased out entirely, leading to the development of psychedelic epics like Yes's Close to the Edge, which treated the side of the 12-inch record as one giant 19-minute long piece. In other cases, however, the original single changed when being mixed for the album. The most obvious example of this comes from the Beatles, whose hit single Revolution was split into two very different tracks when it appeared on the White Album.
You say you want a revolution, well, you know, we all want to change the world. You tell me that it's evolution, well, you know.
Essentially, as artists became more and more intimate with albums as a concept, many struggled to preserve the importance of the radio single, and with mainstream rock, this would prove to be a problem. That's why, nowadays, the albums from this era that are received in high public regard aren't the psychedelic projects so much as the concept albums released right after. These projects use theming as a tool to tie tracks together in a way which didn't sacrifice the catchiness of the radio single. It's the eternal struggle of releasing an album, balancing the individuality of tracks with the cohesion of a complete project, and it's a struggle that Josh Homme knew very well. When talk of a follow-up to Rated R entered the picture, it was Nick Oliveri who came up with the idea of making Queen's third record a concept album, and Homme hated the idea. The only way he knew how to get people to listen to an entire record at once was to take the Welcome to Sky Valley route and make navigating tracks as difficult as humanly possible. If Queens was trying to bring new styles of rock to the mainstream, making the album a concept would work directly against that goal. The only way to make it work would be to separate the narrative context from the tracks entirely, both physically and ideologically. The tracks could be enhanced by the narrative, but would still be powerful without it. In order to do that, the album would need a solid framing device, and given Queen's goal of wanting to dominate the radio space, there really was no better option than the radio itself. Songs for the Deaf is about a car trip. It chronicles a man's drive from the bustling city of Los Angeles to the desert park of Joshua Tree, deep in the Mojave Desert. And throughout the record, we as listeners slowly learn more and more about the nature of the drive, the man's personal struggles, and the reason why he left in the first place. But above all else, the album would be driven by an absolutely killer selection of tracks. This is how the story begins. So I got in my car the other day, and when I turned the key, this soft, mellow song kicked in on the radio. It wasn't the song I wanted to hear, so I turned the radio to something that rocked a bit harder. I'm intoxicated with every drug imaginable, and I'm really pissed off. I also happen to be voiced by Nick Oliveri. Toro is in direct reference to Tequila Ajatoro, a golden liquor which goes down fairly smooth and is quite easy to take shot after shot of. Despite making a whole album about drug use prior, it doesn't appear as if the subject matter has changed dramatically for Queens. They're still drug addicts and they're still self-aware. But instead of being framed about the addiction itself, Songs for the Deaf frames it around something else. The title of the song juxtaposes how good intoxication feels against how foolish it appears to the nebulous you. Who is you? We'll get back to that. Throughout the entire record, the tracklist is just banger after banger. Just as Queens wanted, these singles dominated the charts. No One Knows, the lead single, topped the US modern rock charts and peaked at 51 on Billboard. The second single, Go With The Flow, also hit the top 10 on the US modern rock charts. And all of the singles managed to do well in the UK charts as well. That's in large part due to this undoubtedly being the best Queens lineup of their history. This is the only record with three incredibly talented vocalists at the forefront, matching their respective ranges with the tone and feel they want for a particular track. Just as the opener wouldn't work nearly as well without Oliveri screaming, tracks like Hanging Tree wouldn't sound as unsettling as they do without Mark Lanigan's deep baritone vibratos.
Round the hanging tree, swaying in the breeze, in the summer sun, as with you I want, sway.
And the track right after is practically defined by Homme's distinct vocal tone. This variety in how a song's lyrics are expressed extend to how the instruments are played as well. While the opener featured incredibly heavy production, No One Knows revolves around a very simple blues riff on the guitar. The guitar in this song sounds clean and relatively undistorted, and when combined with some perfectly complementary drums from Dave Grohl of Foo Fighters and Nirvana fame, and the clean Josh Homme vocals, makes for an extremely accessible sound with only a slight tinge of the heaviness that other tracks on the album showcase. Wasn't I telling a story? We'll get back to that. But there's more to making good radio singles than just tone. Radio hits need to be catchy, replayable, and perhaps most importantly, singable. And that's something Queens did better here than any other album in their discography. Every single track on the record, not just the singles, has a short, simple, and singable chorus that can easily be picked up by anyone in the car at the time. The third track's chorus, for example, amounts to repeating the same sentence 4 times over to slightly different melodies.
First it give it, then it take it away. First it give it, then it take it away.
The same thing applies to God Is on the Radio.
Come back another day and do no wrong. You come back another day and do no wrong.
Or, if that's too complicated, just put on Song for the Dead, whose chorus has no lyrics and is still singable and memorable as ever. It's important not to confuse these simple choruses with lazy songwriting, however, because outside of the choruses, these songs have real nuance to their lyrics. That last track, with no lyrics in the chorus, closes its first verse with the line,
If you're hanging around, I'm holding the news.
This rather depressing reference to suicide is pretty clever on its own, as most listeners won't expect the phrase hanging around to refer to a literal hanging, but the lyric gains further meaning in the next verse, which begins with,
Come a little bit closer and get untied.
Now the hanging metaphor is thrown on its head. Instead of the word untied being used to refer to a physical knot on a noose, in this line, it's referring to how liberating the escape of death seems to the vocalist as a depressed drug addict. Sometimes the lyrics paint a very specific picture as to what the song is about, but in other cases it's a bit less clear. Gonna Leave You second verse seems to tell a story about a bad relationship.
I gave it a start. I stopped when you are. This is the end. No more pictures. We ain't friends.
But then, as the verse comes to a close, the content gets far more ambiguous.
It's raining in my room. There's blood in my spoon. You're out of my high chair. I'm out of your womb.
One interpretation of this lyric, as done by fans on Genius, argues that these lines all refer to there being a child, as spoon, high chair, and womb being used in 3 consecutive lines point to that sort of imagery. The problem with that interpretation is that Oliveri, our vocalist, takes ownership of the high chair and spoon. And if an adult is in their room with a spoon on an album talking about drug use, it only seems logical to conclude that he's talking about heroin. That conclusion, however, directly contradicts with the image painted at the start of the verse about a troubled relationship with a significant other. So which one is it? Is this verse about leaving drugs or leaving a significant other? That's sort of the point. It's both, but also neither. I think it's time we revisit the story of this album and figure out what's really going on here. So our main character got into his car the other day and just started to drive out into the open desert. Why did he leave? We find out in another love song.
By the time you read my letter, baby, I'll be gone.
He was leaving a bad relationship. Before he left, of course, he went on a bit of a bender. What was taken? Well, maybe. At the very least, we know for certain that our main character drank from the first track and took some painkillers, as the second track illustrates.
We get these pills. pills to swallow, how they stick in your throat, taste like gold.
The effect of painkillers doesn't last very long, and after the high wears off, users typically get more depressed than they were before taking them. This is part of the reason why painkillers and heroin are so addictive. The feeling like a millionaire wears off as soon as the third track.
First it give it, then it take it away.
This rationalizes the incredibly dark imagery from the next few tracks discussed earlier. Tracks like A Song for the Dead and Hanging Tree give voice to the mind of our drugged up main character, but in Six Shooter, the character himself is given the mic, leading to the nonsensical screaming explosion that is that track. After Hanging Tree, the girl our main character left finally re-enters the picture, but the thoughts aren't complete. As discussed with Gonna Leave You, the intentionally ambiguous lyrics conflate his relationship issues with his drug addiction. While there is some substantial retrospect and go with the flow, the subject matter quickly turns back to the drugs as soon as 2 tracks later on Do It Again.
I fall over and over and over, won't you? I get in, I get in, I get in, you're the only one I'm into.
That's the point. Despite wanting to maintain a steady relationship, the addictions take greater importance. The you from the first track has changed from being the girl to the drug. His addiction is the only one he's into. But that realization is too much for our hero, so the second that track ends, he changes the station, effectively trying to ignore the real psychological problems that affect him. But that won't work, because as the next track states,
The guy was leaking through the stereo between the station and station.
it's more than that though. Lanigan isn't just shoving some religious message down our throats. In this song, God is a point of comparison. The full verse to this song begins as such.
Say the devil is paranoid, always trying to cover, but God was leaking through the stereo between the station and station.
The true meaning of this song can only be understood in the context of the album's narrative. Rock music and its derivatives have often been viewed as the devil by many concerned parents. The Queens don't vocally disagree with that narrative outright. Instead, they subvert it by saying that even in the most sinister and evil of music, good can still reside. The radio, this device that everyone has in their cars, can be used as a tool. Not only a tool to frame a killer rock album around, but a tool for people to reflect and learn more about themselves.
A song for the deaf, that is for you.
This album is called Songs for the Deaf. It is a collection of tracks not for people who can't listen, but for people who won't listen. Our main character driving through the desert, he certainly won't listen. He left because he won't listen. He changes the station because he won't listen. God may be in the radio, but the only way to know for sure is to pay attention. But listening is hard. Listening takes work, and for a washed-up drug addict driving off into the depths of the desert, there's a far easier choice to make. The final track is my personal favorite of the album. It's an eerie warning to those who still can listen. Don't ignore your problems. Don't change the station. Listen and confront your issues instead of driving off into the California desert. If not, your illusion of progress will put you back right where you started. For those who do listen, the album hides one final treat, a bonus track called Mosquito Song. Despite being on an album with songs like Hanging Tree and Song for the Deaf, this is arguably the most depressing track on the entire record. Its talk of human insignificance and the meaninglessness of life fits the end of our character's story, however. It's his song, the song he sings as he lives a cycle of drug addiction and abuse. Instead of turning around and looking back on his past, he looks forward, and all that lies ahead is the empty desert. Queens of the Stone Age were never quite the same after Songs for the Deaf. Dave Grohl left his temporary spot as drummer, and Nick Oliveri was kicked from the band over a controversy surrounding a domestic abuse situation in his personal life. Mark Lanegan would stick around for the next record and leave the band after, only making minor contributions to the next few albums. The fantastic lineup that led to this level of musical diversity would never be replicated in an album since. The storytelling aspect of Queen's music would also suffer. The band would never attempt to make another concept album, and while some tracks from 2013's Like Clockwork have fantastic imagery, nothing from even that record would come close to competing with Songs for the Deaf. That said, the Queens still make music, and they still make good music. Their 2017 record Villains was incredibly well received in spite of its awful production, and their shows continue to sell well, with consistently positive reception from those who weren't kicked in the face by the band's frontman. Ultimately, however, the status of the band now doesn't change the records we got, and Songs for the Deaf remains one of the greatest rock albums of the early 2000s. It not only featured a fantastic tracklist with incredible diversity, but also used radio as a framing device to tell a meaningful story with a powerful message. Don't change the station. The music is on the radio. All you have to do is listen.
You're listening to ANT, the High Desert Wonder Valley favorite radio station. It's been a good night. Dave Catching here. Not saying good night, just saying.
Sounds different when you got gloves on. Thank you so much for watching this video on Songs for the Deaf. I put a lot of time into it. I really love this album. Even if this may not be the best time to listen to this album because it's like winter, but really it's an anytime album. It's just a good album. Go listen to it again, or for the first time, or for the second. I don't know how many times you listen to this thing. A lot of people think, as always, they're kind of hovering over the steering wheel area of the car right now, I believe. Thanks to all of those people that helped me work out the script, especially because that was a bit of a challenge to write, and give me suggestions on, certain footage that maybe I should use in certain parts of the video, or certain, albums that I should reference or something like that, because there's a lot of history behind the concept album, and I didn't just want to throw in just the obvious ones or the ones that I care about, because music is more universal than that. What a lovely day it is today. It's kind of cold, actually. It's like, less than 20 degrees, and I'm out here filming about a freaking desert rock concept album. If this is your first video that you're watching on this channel, then I should let you know that I don't just make videos about music. In fact, I haven't made a music related video in quite a long time, and I want that to change in 2018, of course. So I focus on the media analysis. So that could be, a movie, it could be a TV show, it could be a video game, it could be the news, it could be, I don't know. The next video I'm making is pretty weird for me. Now, normally during these credit bits, I like plugging some of my other videos, so that way I give you some, something else to watch if you haven't watched some of my stuff before. So I think it would be stupid of me not to plug the other music video I've made on this channel. It's about Metallica's Saint Anger. I don't love that album because it's not good, but it is a bit of a guilty pleasure, and so in that video that is not as good or well made as this one, I talk about some of the reasons why the album kind of failed at what it was trying to do, but then I also kind of turn that around. I'm like, well, maybe this is why it's a guilty pleasure. And then the other video I'm gonna plug is a video on The End Is Nigh. It's this crazy, awesome indie platformer video game that came out last year, and it was so good that the creators of the game said that the video was good and shared it on their social media, which is like, what? How? That's about all I got. I don't know how long these credits have been going. I don't know how many cuts I make with this, but yeah, stay tuned for what comes next. It's pretty crazy. I have the next few videos sort of lined up, so I'm hoping that production moves a bit more quickly at the start of this year anyway. Then I have to get a job and enter the real world. Got one semester of college left. See how that goes. That's it, I guess. Later. Give me soul and show me the door. Metal baby, soft at the core. Give me tarot, give me some more. Give me tarot, give me some more. Give me tarot, give me some more.